Welcome to Leadership Reimagined, where game-changing conversations are reshaping the world of work. I'm Janice Ellig, the CEO and founder of Ellig Group, Executive Search Advisors, where we are reimagining search through our long-standing commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I am delighted today to welcome MaryAnne Gilmartin, the founder and chief executive officer of MAG Partners, a New York-based real estate development company, which she founded in 2018. Most recently, MaryAnne also served as interim chief executive officer and chair of the board of directors of Mack Cali Realty Corporation. MAG Partners is a woman-owned urban real estate company with decades of experience developing impactful, iconic, large-scale projects incorporating principles of beauty, diversity, and sustainability to create great places with lasting value for their partners, investors, and communities. A very active civic leader in the New York metropolitan area, MaryAnne serves as chair emeritus of the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership, a member of the executive committee of the Brooklyn Academy of Music, member of the New York Public Radio Board of Trustees, member of the executive committee and board of governors of the Real Estate Board of New York, and part of the industry advisory board of the MS Real Estate Development Program at Columbia University. In addition to her civic and industry board service, MaryAnne was appointed a member of the board of directors of the global investment banking firm Jefferies Group, LLC, in 2014. This is a very busy woman, and MaryAnne, I'm so happy and delighted you could join us today. Thank you for being here.
Janice, thank you so much for having me here today. And I would like to shout out to you for your trailblazing, tireless advocacy for creating more equity and more diversity in boardrooms and C-suites around the country and the globe. There are very few people like you, and I just want to say that it has been in my journey an inspiration to watch you take a cause and really drive it forward in a way that produce tangible and lasting results for the business community and for women at large. So thank you for that.
Thank you, MaryAnne. You know, and I've watched your journey over the number of years now that we've known each other, and it's really been a remarkable one, especially because you're in this male-dominated field, real estate. Can you give us some insights on that journey?
Well, let me begin by saying serendipity had a lot to do with it. I think we all need a plan, but we all need to be prepared for that plan to be upended. I was an urban fellow under the Koch administration. I was granted a fellowship to come into government. It was the city's only recruitment mechanism in the late 80s. And you were able to pick your agency and work directly with commissioners and heads of agencies. And in that process, I was encouraged by the leadership of the fellowship program to really try something that was outside of your area of interest. And so I was on my way to law school, hoping to fight for the rights of juveniles in the justice system. And I did a ton of interviewing with commissioners around the city. And as you know, Janice, in the 80s, coming out of the fiscal crisis, the city was a very different place. The physical plant was terrible. There was absolutely no way for anyone to hire anybody because there was a freeze on new hires. So urban fellows were sought out, and every commissioner in the city wanted an urban fellow. So the press was on, and you got all sorts of offers to come into agencies and shadow the commissioners. And I just, again, on a whim, I had 2 fellowships, a summer fellowship and an academic year. And I decided to try economic development. It was a very sophisticated quasi-public agency with a president, a board of directors, carpeting, and air conditioning. And at the time, the city was just a really horrendous place to work. And again, I went to school in the Bronx. I'm pretty tough, but I have to say, walking into the Public Development Corporation, I thought, you know what? I could spend a summer here and just figure this economic development thing out and try it on for size. And it was then and there that I realized I had real estate development in my veins. Would never have known it had I not spent that summer doing projects around the city, large-scale public-private partnerships. And 7 years into that gig, I realized I could cross over to the private sector, do some of the very same game-changing work, and actually earn a better living and do it with a company and a balance sheet instead of a city government. And so Bruce Ratner recruited me to come and work at Forest City. And there began my career in the private sector, doing large-scale projects, lots of projects with government partners. I spent 23 years working in that company for our city, had an incredible run and a lot of luck building amazing, iconic buildings around New York, ground up. And then I had the great fortune of operating those properties. So I became a pretty able placemaker, builder, and operator of real estate all throughout New York City. And that career experience was really mind-opening for me, and it really became my craft, and it was all I wanted to do. At the same time, I was working for a public company that was in the public markets as a non-REIT. And at the time, any public company in real estate really was a REIT. And so Forest City had to figure itself out, had to come up with some strategic alternatives, and turned itself into a REIT. And at that time, I realized many of the things I did with Bruce Ratner, I would never do again, because the world had shifted. Development was not really of interest to the public markets. The long-term value creation of that craft was not appreciated. And it was really, what have you done for me lately? And so I decided to exit the company after 5 years as the CEO, went to the company, and they were very supportive of my moving on. And in fact, granted me an assignment, a very robust assignment, where I had 2 years of a bankable contract with Forest City to continue to work on some of their challenges. And that, in fact, allowed me the working capital to found my own company with a team of trusted professionals with whom I had built my career at Forest City.
MaryAnne, though, going into real estate now in your own business, this is a tough industry to break into. And of course, you had that time with Bruce Ratner and partners and built some iconic buildings, but you had to have had some major challenging times, right? You kept going. What were some of these drivers that just kept you in it and to overcome some of those obstacles?
I think some of it is just DNA. I came from a childhood that really, the only thing that was certain was a lot of uncertainty. And I think that developers need to feel very comfortable with lots of moving parts. I call it the great Rubik's Cube of real estate. And if you're uncomfortable settling after a long day with lots of disparate parts floating around, making decisions, connecting dots, and driving forward, it can be unnerving for people that aren't comfortable amid chaos and a certain dynamic process for which I don't believe there's any other in real estate, like real estate development on a large scale basis. And so I certainly am comfortable with change. I'm comfortable with complexity. I can tell you that it is a cyclical business, and therefore the highs are amazing and the lows are staggeringly challenging. And living through downturns, through 9/11, through Superstorm Sandy, and what that did to the built environment in New York and what that did to our business really made me a better developer and a better leader. But it is because I really don't cower in the face of difficulty. And I really enjoy and I'm very passionate about my work. And I think that really does matter. And finally, I never got that memo that said, as a woman in the real estate business, you should feel extremely intimidated and be really bashful at the table. I think I came from meritocracy. Bruce Ratner brought me through the business, and all of my colleagues believing it was the best man or woman for the job. And so I always had his support. He always had my back. And as I became more capable, as I took on more responsibility, Bruce wanted me to take on more, to do more, and to become the face of the New York company. And with that kind of support, to me, it's just proof positive that what we as women in this profession are looking for is a level playing field and an opportunity to compete in a meritocracy.
Well, I'm glad you never got that memo because you didn't let gender come in to what you knew was just something that fit your style and how you operate. We're going to talk about some of the newer projects, but let's go back in terms of some 4 high-profile development firms in New York City, and you were the driving force behind the Barclays Center, Pacific Park, which transformed Brooklyn, and the formidable New York Times building. Not too many women can claim, I can maybe think of only one other in your league here, who can claim such iconic projects. In taking those on, what did you aim to do going forward with them? Was this going to be sort of one of your signatures, or tell us about how this came about?
So I think what I became focused on during my career at Forest City was this notion that we can build beautiful projects. We can do it with and for people that look like our great city. And we can create lasting value for our partners, our investors, and the communities in which we build. And that sounds really straightforward. It's not so easy to do. In many ways, the built environment in New York City for very long had been a commoditized industry. It didn't matter whether your buildings were high quality, whether they were good looking, whether they delivered for the communities in which they were located. You still could make a lot of money and claim success. And I became focused on this notion of the lasting presence of a tower on a skyline on the ground planes of New York City, and the responsibility that we give real estate developers to create places. And so I took it very seriously. And when I convinced Bruce Ratner to chase the New York Times bid, he said to me, Marianne, we are not going to win that bid. We're more Brooklyn than we are Park Avenue. The fix is in. It's going to be the old boys network, and you're wasting your time. And I do love some competition, so I pleaded with him to let me try. And if I failed, I would learn along the way. And he begrudgingly let me chase this assignment in 1999. And we were amongst the highest profile developers in all of New York City. And after a fairly arduous bidding process, won the assignment. Now, it takes many, many people and a lot of hard work to win an assignment like the partnership with the New York Times to build a brand new headquarters building for a company that's in a neighborhood that's named after itself and that moves its home every 100 years. And so there was a certain sense of just gravitas around the assignment. And I was given a lot of the credit for winning that assignment and putting that great building together with the New York Times as a partner and a tenant, and with Renzo Piano as the architect. And that process, going through and creating that great building through 9/11, at a time when people laughed at the notion that 8th Avenue would be a legit location for law firms, media firms, hedge funds. Everybody just thought it was a joke, and I was laughed at by the brokerage community in thinking that we could build an amazing icon across from the Port Authority on 8th Avenue. And lo and behold, conviction, a lot of time, a commitment to quality, and great sponsorship like the Gray Lady allowed us to do something extraordinary. And that building, this is public information, for Forest City, just half of the tower that we owned created $1 billion of value creation. Just the top half of the building. And that became a trophy asset for the company, but it also changed forever the way that I looked at my business. I didn't want to be part of forgettable construction projects that were really driven by only an economic formula and not by a commitment to quality and principles of sustainability. And so prior to my ascension to the role of CEO, there were buildings and projects built around New York City by Forest City that maybe were not the finest in terms of quality, but were in lots of different neighborhoods around the city. And I just became committed to doing projects like the New York Times in terms of quality, sponsorship, and lasting sustainability. And it was imperative. It was an existential moment for me to recognize that if I was going to continue to do this, I had to try and do it that way, that was the only way for me and anybody that wanted to be on my team.
You know, you really are, as this podcast is going to be entitled, a modern placemaker. You don't just do development. In fact, you really are making places that are really quite beautiful. And I didn't realize the New York Times building, you went into this and then 9/11 happened, right? So you had to carry on through that awful time for real estate.
And if you can remember, Janice, after 9/11, there was this idea that nobody would want to be on a high floor in a building.
Right.
And so this notion that we had negotiated hard to control and lease the top half of the tower and gave the New York Times the lower half. We were building the whole building, but they were going to be the occupant of the lower half. And we were so happy to have been able to drive rents and value through the upper half of the tower. And then suddenly that felt like maybe that was a terrible idea. And I'm going to get to this issue of the power of partnerships, because the New York Times taught me so much about the importance of relationships and the power of partnership. At every milestone event, the New York Times took a moment to bring us together, to mark the milestone, to pay tribute to progress, and to really fuel the team into their, to continuing forward and delivering on greatness. And I'll never forget the week after 9/11, the Times was asked quite pointedly, were they planning on continuing with their headquarters building, which was designed and was described as a modern icon, a masterpiece of the modern millennium that was going to create transparency in its ground plane and would be open to all New Yorkers in its lobby and in its public spaces. And the New York Times said, we don't believe that any New Yorker would want to occupy a building that could be built to withstand the attacks of 9/11, and that we have to learn from that moment, but that we as the New York Times will be forging forward as a sign of this city's great resiliency. We're going to build this highly transparent, beautiful tower on 12 subway lines across from a major terrorist target called the Port Authority, and we're going to do it with pride and commitment and prosperity. And that's in fact what happened. And that was, again, a great lesson to me, the power of partnership and conviction and passion for what we're doing.
And Marianne, that is your reputation. You are committed. You have the power of your convictions. You are a team player. You're highly collaborative. And that building, it alone demonstrates, what a great leader in New York City can do. So I want to take a moment to remind our audience that you are listening to A Modern Placemaker, MaryAnne Gilmartin, the founder and chief executive officer of MAG Partners. The topics we cover, like today's, are all current, and a new topic with a new game changer is released on the third Thursday of every month. This is a great way to stay current on relevant issues happening around us. Now let's return to MaryAnne. So MaryAnne, when I look at some of the projects you've done, like New York Times Building, Barclays Center, you also have some new projects underway. And in the bidding on the development of a corner site in Chelsea, you were one of 7 bidding on that. Yet MAG Partners was selected. How did you win that deal? And why you over others?
That's a great question. And I'm going to be humble and say that I think it's actually a pretty straightforward formula for me, which really comes down to the importance of relationships, the power of integrity, and the need to demonstrate strong execution. So you had on 28th Street a parking lot site that most every developer in New York tried to pick up. And it's owned by the Edison family. And the Edison family is known to be a very difficult and quirky family. I love them. They're not easy. They were taught never to sell real estate, always to keep the value in the family. And so they were only prepared to do a ground lease with a developer. And they were very, very hard negotiators. And so I had developed a relationship with one of the principals. And I asked for 90 days to put together a transaction that worked for the family and worked for my company. And I was basically given 90 days with the promise that it would go to the dinner table, but we would never know if it were going to pass the family test. And so using sensible business practices, pushing where I could push it, being reasonable where I could be reasonable, we negotiated a transaction that worked for the Edison family, worked for my company, and all the while ensuring that I could continue on the mission of deploying commercial approaches to overcome challenges, not run a company where social responsibility and inclusion are an afterthought. And as nearly one of the only women-owned development companies, I don't think it was lost on the family. This is a family of women who I think believed that I took my work very seriously and that I was very strong in execution. And if you can imagine when you own a piece of dirt and you decide that you're going to build on it, but that you're only going to keep the ownership interest in the land and have somebody else handle the improvements, you become obsessed with this idea that if you pick the wrong horse, you could end up with a partially built building. And so I think for the owner of the land, it was super important that they bet on the right company, that in the face of a lot of challenges, it's a very difficult business in New York, as you know, this is pre-pandemic, they looked across the field of alternatives and they decided to bet on me. And I think it was based on a very deep dive into my reputation, into my team's capabilities, and into the fact that I was interested in creating long-term value and that a beautiful building was as important as an economically prosperous building.
Sounds like you really built trust with them, that they knew that you were going to respect and honor what they wanted well as a business owner, right? So it was a delicate balance, but win-win for both.
For sure. And tomorrow, I'm very proud to say that we're going to top out construction of that 480 unit building at 241 West 28th Street. And we'll be delivering that building at the end of 2022. But if you think about, the hundreds of stories behind any real estate project in New York City, you can only imagine after we won the rights to develop it, designed a beautiful building, and we're lining up the financing, and the pandemic hit. And this became sort of a binary question of, would you bet on New York at this moment or not? And again, going back to this power of partnerships, the capital partners that I had put together in that transaction, Safanad, Atalaya Capital Management, and Qualitas, all three of my capital partners were willing to bet on me, my team, and the city. And it was a really profound moment for us, because if you go back a year ago, this November, just pretty much a year ago, and imagine going out and looking for $173 million of financing. We could easily have said, we're going to take a time out, we're going to take a step back. But again, studying the fundamentals, knowing the market, knowing the submarket of West Chelsea, and believing in New York City and not being prepared to write its obituary, as so many do so many times in a period of crisis, we recommended forging forward. And of course, now, Janice, it looks like an act of brilliance, because as you know, the residential market has rebounded. Rents are almost back to pre-pandemic levels. And because it was so difficult to get anything done and started, we are now sitting with one of only a few brand new multifamily buildings that will deliver not just market rate housing, but 30% affordable units for low and middle income New Yorkers.
Marianne, this is the one at 335 8th Avenue, right?
No, this is 241 West 28th Street. This is the maiden voyage for my company. As you know, I have over $1 billion in assets under development. So the second project, I call it the cousin to 28th Street, is this building on 8th Avenue. Many New Yorkers know this site because it is the tennis bubble site, part of the Penn South cooperative, which is 2,280 units of housing in Chelsea that has existed since 1962. It is perpetually affordable housing for New York families that many of whom generation after generation live in the Penn South community. And they realized to stay sustainable and to keep their properties maintained and in a modern condition, they needed to turn one of their older properties into a new development, and they held a competition. And in fact, we were awarded this opportunity to build 188 residential units after a pretty grueling competition. And again, they're doing this because the proceeds of this transaction will be used by the cooperative at Penn South to fund operating expenses and help them maintain affordability for the New Yorkers that live in that limited equity housing co-op. So again, this is a project that not only I think is going to deliver really great value for our financial partners, but for the community of Penn South, will give them the financial wherewithal to keep their properties up to date and maintain the grounds and the beautiful buildings that make up that very large area along 8th Avenue.
You have a focus on low and middle income residents, don't you? I mean, in terms of really improving housing benefits for communities. Is this part of the mission of MAG Partners going forward?
It's a great question. In New York City, most are not aware, if you're not in our business, that most rental housing in this city is built with some level of affordability. That's what allows developers the tax incentive that is, fundamental to making the economics work. So forever and a day, developers have been building rental housing in the city. It's almost invisible to New Yorkers that a building might have 80% luxury, 20% low income inside of a single building. And it's a formula that's worked. Over the last 5 years, there's been a demand to create a higher percentage of affordability. And I support and applaud that requirement. And so much of what I want to do is build multifamily housing in the city, because I think with a housing crisis that has really plagued this city for all of the time that I've lived here, you could never overbuild the multifamily sector of our business. And it is the kind of building that once you build it, you typically as a builder would hold on to it because it's an annuity. It's the gift that keeps on giving because people will rent your apartments. There's just simply not enough rental housing in the city. So I hope to create all types of housing in Mag Partners platform, both market rate housing, affordable housing, and I'm fascinated by workforce housing. If you think about teachers, firemen, police officers, folks like that, they ought to be able to live close to the urban core. It's silly that the backbone of our city, particularly if you imagine a lot of the frontline workers, right? These are folks that can't afford to live in the dense urban core. They're pushed out to the outer areas of our city or even to the suburbs. Those folks deserve to have an opportunity to live in city centers with workforce housing. And so I think we're going to see a lot more of that in cities going forward. And I hope that Mag Partners can have a meaningful impact in changing the complexion of housing across our city.
Let me turn to international cities, Dubai, Shanghai, others that are more in the 21st century. Their infrastructure is in place. They're more modern. How do you evaluate New York City? And do you think we can really reimagine New York City with more affordable housing, with more of a sustainable city? What do you see for the future of New York?
I was fascinated in listening to Dan Dockeroff talk about this, and I share a lot of his views about what it means to be a modern global city. And it comes down to high performance. And unfortunately, New York City, enjoys a very tired, old housing stock, actually building stock, over 70 years of age, the average age of New York City buildings. Our buildings are sick, they're unhealthy, they're not brought up to modern standards. I use Hudson Yards as an example, Janice. We all know that Hudson Yards was not a blockbuster success because of its proximity to transit, right? It's not easy to get there.
Right.
What it does have is high-performing 21st century buildings that were thought out and that focus on the needs of modern day business. And I believe as a city, when you do look around the globe and you see what's happening in Shanghai, Dubai, and other 21st century cities, New York really needs to up its game. It needs to improve its built environment, and frankly, it needs to improve the business climate for companies because we're fairly hostile to businesses. It's a very tough city to live in and to work in today. And notwithstanding that, it's the greatest city on earth. It's a magnet for talent. It's an incubator for big, innovative ideas. And all of that has worked to our advantage. But if you think about it, some of these other factors need to shift and need to move to a place where we keep up with the competition. We shouldn't rest on our laurels. And so people like Dan Dockeroff and other civic leaders that are committed to driving New York City into the 21st century should be applauded. And I think the infrastructure bill hopefully will bring good news for New York as we try to strengthen the infrastructure network and system in our city. It's vital for us to compete with other global cities.
I'm going to put you on the spot for a moment. If you could do 3 things to really accelerate those changes for New York City and for its inhabitants and draw in more businesses and draw in, more residents as opposed to them leaving, and you could be in charge and make it happen, what would you do?
The first is I would work on creating housing that brings people to the city in a more hospitable way. We are a country of cities. There are more people living in cities ever today than in the history of the world. And so if we build it, they will come. And it shouldn't be so difficult, and it shouldn't cost New Yorkers such a high percentage of their income to live here. I would start with NYCHA. I would take the city's public housing and I would remass it. I would use the property to drive value for the city so that they could improve public housing and create diverse housing stock in and around public housing, because there shouldn't be a poor door. There should be diversity in the housing stock within a particular submarket. And I think that public housing, I don't know if you've ever toured a NYCHA building, but it is still one of the most devastating property tours I've ever taken, just to see how people live. And it is just not acceptable that New York City itself is a slumlord. And that has to change. And I think any leader running the city needs to take responsibility for that. So housing, and housing. That's number one. Number two, infrastructure. We have just got to improve our city streets, our subways, and our bridges. And I think a lot of this can be done through technology. But I think that the investment has to be real, has to be meaningful and sizable. And we have an opportunity down in Washington now because of the infrastructure bill to harness a lot of funding to shape our city's future and make it more 21st century in terms of its infrastructure. And then finally, education. We have to improve our education system. Public education is important. It's always been important. We need to figure out a way to pay our teachers better, to improve the facilities in the city, in and around the city, and to rise all tides. And I think that public schools need to be a place where people enter with hope and possibility and come out with a fishing net, not the fish, if that makes sense. We need to create opportunities for our public school children, and they need to really be not an afterthought, which I think, unfortunately, that is the case. And then I'll just add one more, which is, I was on the Rikers Commission, and I was part of a commission to study Rikers, the largest penal colony in the world. And I will tell you that Rikers is, over 450 acres. It has no constituents living in and around the prison, but the occupants themselves. And so if you think about it, it's an unbelievable piece of real estate. And whether it becomes infrastructure island or whether it becomes a place to build a massive amount of housing, Rikers Island should be thought of and should become a super big focus of government in the next decade. And as we look to reshape the way we handle jails in our city, we should bring that closer to the communities. And if you look at community efforts to deal with convictions when they go deep on issues of mental illness, of addiction, and of family dysfunction, to try to keep people out of jail and give them the help that they need. And there are great models, not just in New York City's neighborhoods, but also globally. And I think we should study those, and we should dismantle Rikers, and we should become a model for cities around the world in terms of how we deal with the incarcerated.
Marianne, that's really creative thinking on reimagining the use of the land like that, and of course, our penal system as well. But you're right. You have to look at things differently and say, what else could it be used for? How else can we, shore up society here in New York City? That's a wonderful idea. I hope somebody picks up on it. And I know you will be at the different public-private partnership tables driving a lot of new ideas. Before we have to close, and I could go on, there's so much yet to be done here. In prior interviews, you've talked about your hopes of establishing something known as she building. Can you just tell us what that means to you?
It's interesting. It's in some ways a very small idea that could have a very big impact. And it's quite straightforward, which is that imagine that we put a building together in New York where every bit of the process of putting a building together was driven by a woman. I think that it would be so easy to do this, Janice, because I know of all the talented women that have the ability to design, to construct, to finance, and to operate a building. But I would love New York to be a place where, the first building put together every nook, every cranny, every work stream with a woman at the helm. And I thought of it just because now that I own my own company, and it's quite a remarkable feeling to have a building, a company that I own 100% of, and that I can really take on a passion project like that and do it. And this will not be a surprise to you, but I believe it starts with the money. It is often the money that drives the results in my business. And so I believe that identifying a capital partner that's headed up by a woman is the first and most fundamental step in then creating almost a brief where whoever wants to participate in the creation of this building would need to demonstrate leadership by a woman at the top of the organization. And this is so simple to do. It's just never been done before. And it's interesting. I once got, after an article was written about this idea, somebody that I respect in the business is actually a well-known male in the business, shot me an email saying, I find this to be, I was taken aback by this. How would you feel if we decided to put a building together entirely by men. And I laughed thinking, well, okay, welcome to my world. Like, really? So I just think it's in some ways I was happy because I thought this guy got all worked up about the fact that we were going to go create our own building. And I thought maybe that is a sign of progress, because you and I know when we stop talking about the need for women to be in the boardroom, for women to be in the C-suites, for women to be represented at the very tops of organization, it'll be a yawn. And then you and I will celebrate that when I don't have to talk about what it's like to be a woman in a man's business. Like, then we've gotten somewhere. But I also believe we are not going to have this conversation in an echo chamber. You and I are going to agree on this, but we're not going to change the world if we don't get others involved in the conversation. So going forward, like, I don't want to talk about work-life balance unless there's at least half of the panel are men, because we are all going to agree with each other, but we need to start talking about it with men, because men still rule the world. I don't think it's going to be that way forever. And if you keep doing what you're doing, it will certainly change. But for right now, we should do a she building. And I'm unapologetic about that, because that has not been the norm. That has not been possible up until now. And it's ridiculous to think that it's impossible. So I hope to be part of making it possible as part of my run as the CEO of MAG Partners.
Yes, I know that you and I and others, and a lot of men too, believe you should not ignore half the population, and that there's a number of highly qualified women in underrepresented groups to drive every business. And it's so, like when you were just talking about that man saying, well, women, well, how about if you had men building buildings? Well, that's what they were doing. Sort of like women on boards, they're only 30%, still 70% of the board seats of the S&P 500 are held by men. So of course we need to change that to get to 50-50. And so in the building of New York City and other cities, you're going to drive that. I'm going to drive it in the C-suite in the boardroom. And I think that at some point we'll get to parity, and we'll be in a lot better place for decision-making and good corporate governance. Are there any parting words that you have, Marianne? Because this has been really insightful, and I'm so thankful for having you on.
Well, again, I want to give you a shout out for your Breakfast of Champions, particularly this past breakfast was just remarkable in every possible way. And nobody makes people feel uncomfortable in the most glamorous and sophisticated way that you do in creating change. We need to be uncomfortable. We need to have the tough conversations, and we need to work hard at doing it. And you really have been all of that. And what's amazing about your work is that the results speak for themselves. And I know we have a lot more to do, but when I think about the metrics and the stats that you were able to go through at that breakfast, and you brought the kind of leadership and thought leadership to the conference the way that you did, it just gives it. I was so proud. I was so proud to be part of your first Breakfast of Champions, and then to watch the amazing trajectory of the organization and the effort, all of which is really a result of you and the people that you've enlisted. So I want to say thank you to you, and thank you for just having us all stay addicted to hope.
Well, it's been a decade of driving change, and you've been doing the same thing. And I would tell all of our audience to please go to your website to see all the fabulous projects that you are working on and have already completed. I mean, it's really remarkable what you have done in the field of real estate. You truly are that modern placemaker, and I applaud you for that, Marianne. And thank you for sharing your story with us today. And I look forward to many great things coming out of MAG Partners in the future. So to our audience, thank you for tuning in to another game-changing conversation on Leadership Reimagined, released on the third Thursday of each month. You can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit our website at elliggroup.com. MaryAnne, again, thank you for joining us today. You have redefined real estate as a sector of one which is highly collaborative, and success is driven by partnerships, and that's what you have made happen in your field. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me in today, Janice. It's a pleasure.